This is Jed Brewer with SG Voices and Study Groups. It's really nice to have you on our webinar today. We're going to be talking about the new era of fleet management. I'm really excited to have some experts to be able to share with us about fleet management and asset utilization and how we can maximize those things. From a high level, SG Voices, we are your go-to resource for connecting industry leaders such as these and giving you access to trusted educational content and helping you discover valuable insights that ultimately will help drive your business growth. Our mission at SG Voices is to empower you with relevant and actionable knowledge tailored to the challenges and opportunities that are facing you today. So again, I appreciate having you here. When we think about our business, it's pretty simple, right? We buy inventory. Hopefully we have the right inventory on hand, ready to sell it, not have too much, put it onto a truck, dispatch that truck, deliver it to the customer. Problem solved. Seems simple. As we know, it's actually really complex. And the things that separate the top performers from others in the industry are those who can do all that very efficiently, drive cost out of the system, and ultimately pass on some of that cost and keep some of that cost advantage for ourselves. And when we have a cost advantage, it puts us at a competitive advantage out there in the marketplace. So how do we become as efficient as we can? That's a subject that we're going to be talking about today when we're talking about asset utilization and fleet management. So really excited to have two companies who are leaders in the field. Gravitate, who will be presenting at the beginning, and then we'll turn to Petro-Exchange. Just a high level about Gravitate. They provide AI-driven software, and it's designed to help fuel retailers and wholesalers really optimize their supply and logistics decisions. So all this that we're talking about, the weightless fuel supply and dispatch platform that they have, it allows for supply management, optimized order generation, supply optimization, automatic dispatch, in-cab technology, invoice reconciliation, a bunch of other things. And their goal is to ultimately drive a 10 times ROI when somebody adopts their system. So I'm excited to be able to have Mike Scharf, who's the CEO of Gravitate, as well as Steve Okano, who's a VP of engineering there. They're going to be sharing with us at a high level, how do we go from miles that we're driving down the road to margin, and being efficient in what we do is really that key. And so they're going to be touching on a number of different points so we can actually understand what is driving our margin across both transports and tank wagons, and why doing the same routing logic is going to leave money on the table if you're doing it. Maybe there's a differentiated strategy that would help you actually optimize things. And they're going to help us identify which levers we have to be able to pull on to ultimately drive efficiency in our business. So I'm excited, Mike and Steve, to be able to have you. I'll introduce at the second half more about Towne, who's vice president at Petro-Exchange, and share a little bit more about Don. But Don's going to be talking at a high level about optimizing inventory that we have on hand, making sure we have the right products. And what do we do with that old and slow moving inventory and equipment that we may have? What strategies are around that? So first with Gravitate, Mike and Steve, I'm going to turn the floor over to you. But for the audience, I've got you muted, but we want this to be as educational as possible. So if you have questions, please type those into the dialog box and go to Webinar Framework. I can see those and I'll relay your questions on to our presenters at the appropriate time. We're going to record this and we'll distribute the slides and the recording to you afterwards so you can view it again or share with a colleague. So again, excited to have you here, and let's jump in. Mike, I'm going to turn the floor over to you. From miles to margin, how do we go from there to margin?
Awesome, thank you, Jed. We're excited to be here. Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. I'm Mike Scharf, the co-founder, CEO of Gravitate. Today, as Jed said, I'm joined by Steve Okano, who is our VP of engineering. I started Gravitate in 2011, and over the last 15 years, really spent that time helping refiners, retailers, wholesalers, and carriers optimize downstream operations. And from my perspective, we see the same pattern really across every organization or different organizations. The logos and geographies change, but the operating challenges really are remarkably consistent. Steve leads engineering at Gravitate. His team builds the forecast, and the optimization models that support the kinds of decisions that we're talking about today. He brings the systems and math perspective behind the operating problem. So between the two of us, I think we have a broad perspective. And with that, let's start with the question that I think every operator in the industry probably already knows the answer to. And that question is really, has a job gotten easier in the last 10 years? And I think everyone knows the answer to that is no. It's gotten harder, but I think it's worth talking about why. So yesterday or 5 years ago, the business wasn't simple, but it was more predictable, fewer products, more stable routes, more experienced drivers and dispatchers. Customers expected a delivery, but not necessarily constant updates. And in many markets, probably exist today, a lot of the operation could run on local knowledge, relationships, and repeatable patterns. Today, that operating environment is completely different. Driver shortages have been real, product complexity has grown, regulations have increased, delivery windows are tighter, customers expect visibility. Supply and price volatility creates many more last-minute changes. Fleet fueling has become a meaningful business line, and digital expectations have gone from nice to have to expected. At the same time, everyone's trying to do more with the same trucks, the same people, and the same number of hours in the day. So the important part of this is, technology didn't cause this problem. Success did, growth did, change did. So more customers, more products, more geographies, more service lines. It's really made this operating model much more complex. And if we look at what the inside of many of our businesses look like, this is what it looks like on the inside. We have a bunch of departments that operate really across the business. Pricing has its own tools for setting customer prices. Supply has its view of terminals, contracts, allocations, and market movements. Transport dispatch has its own system and dispatch rules. Tankwagon dispatch may have its own system and its own way of dispatching. And billing is just trying to turn execution into accurate revenue. Customer service, just trying to make sure we're keeping promises that we made with customers. And operations is trying to hold the whole thing together. And each function, may be strong on its own, but the businesses still struggle because these functions are not working from the same picture. You end up with different software, different priorities, different decisions. If you think about it, you've got a bunch of healthy organs, but you've got a weak nervous system. And if the nervous system can't move information quickly, the body can't respond as a whole. And this is where we see many fuel distributors and carriers living today. Departments aren't broken, but the connections between them are too weak. So when we talk about the industry needs better optimization, we're not saying better math inside routing. We're talking about better operating systems to make sure that we're making the right decisions for the entire business. And I want to step back a little bit, and I want to share our perspective on the profit drivers that kind of impact the fuel business. And these are largely from the lens of a fuel distributor or wholesaler, but most of the profit drivers really apply to a retailer and a carrier as well. So we've kind of divided these profit drivers into 5 different categories. And if we work through them, the first is the customer, right? The customer really matters. So how am I pricing that customer? Is that customer monitored? Are they a call-in customer? Are they purchasing volume ratably? And how well does that customer location or locations fit my network? Is it allowing me to have optimal routing, or is it causing my routing to be less optimal? And if we think about what matters most when we think about transport and tank wagons, price matters. How I'm pricing the customer matters. But when we think about the tank wagon business, the other things that really matter, network fit really matters. And you may not have the network fit on every single customer location, but if you don't, you better be pricing it appropriately. And then the other thing that we've seen really matters when we think about a tank wagon business is the number of customers that you have that are monitored. So as you increase the customers that are monitored, you get more flexibility in being able to determine when a customer needs a load and how much volume to deliver, which will allow you to run that business more optimally. So that's the first driver. The second driver is supply, and supply is all about lowest delivery cost across contracts, rack, inventory. It's about making the right market timing decisions. Can I push or pull a load? Really important. It's the number one driver for transports. For tank wagons, it's also really important. But the thing with tank wagons that's equally important is profit per hour or profit per shift. So sometimes, it's not going to make sense to go save 2 cents if it takes another 2 hours when I'm not able to hit the right profit per hour numbers. So I think what we find is it's really important when you're making those optimal supply decisions that you're also looking at how these decisions are impacting your profit per shift or profit per hour. Third is dispatch. And dispatch is about hitting windows, optimizing routing, optimizing the driver's shift, and leveraging your equipment, your tractor assets. For transports, historically, it's always been loaded miles. Loaded miles is what matters. Can I hit 50% or 51 or 52%? Driver shift utilization matters as well. Truck utilization matters as well. But this is another area where it really, really varies with tank wagons. With tank wagons, again, I'm not concerned about loaded miles. I'm really concerned about profit per shift. And volume per shift as a proxy for profit per shift. And the way, and you mentioned this, Jed, the way we optimize transports is very different than the way we optimize tank wagons. And we're happy to drill into that later. But what's interesting about this is as we've started to build out integrated transport and tank wagons, we started challenging some of the profit drivers that we've used for transports, because profit per shift is a really good measure that we believe some wholesalers and carriers should start looking at. Next, delivery execution. For both transports and tank wagons, loading the right volume, capturing the BOL volume, delivering in the right tank with the right products matters. But what equally matters in tank wagons is on-truck inventory management. Knowing at any point in time how much inventory is on that truck and getting visibility into your actual or potential retain or left on board volume. This is an area where many tank wagon distributors, I think, are leaving money on the table because they're not proactively managing that retain and finding a place for it. And then finally, billing really matters, and minimizing exceptions, time to bill, time to pay. Very similar across transports and tank wagons. But the one thing I'll say is the longer you let an exception go within the tank wagon business, the harder it is to get payment. So it's really important to be able to bill timely when you're thinking about your tank wagon business.
Mike, there's a lot of actions in this slide between customer, supply, dispatch, et cetera. And certainly each one of them is important. But do you see maybe one or two areas that really separate the top performers from other firms out there?
I do. I mean, I think it's really about integrated decision making. I think the customers that are really proactively going and finding the right customers in the right networks and pricing them appropriately, that's really important. And then I think it's those organizations that can make integrated supply and dispatch decisions. I would say those two things really across three of these profit areas are really important when we think about maximizing margin. Yeah, great question. So we believe our thesis is, next advantage, what's really important when we think about transport and tank wagon routing, it's not coming from routing in isolation. It's really coming from how do we connect routing to pricing, supply, operations, and billing decisions. And fortunately, we're not the first industry to attack this.
Yeah, and then, so just to jump in here, I can just zoom out a little bit. I'm just coming in a little bit new to the industry, but this is a pattern I think we've seen across a number of different industries, not just fuel distribution. For example, manufacturing systems, they move from a separate function for each of these systems to like an integrated system. Retail move it to integrated systems between merchandising, inventory, and logistics to all become part of like a connected system. One of the things obviously that's driven folks like Walmart's really great growth. I personally come from healthcare and public safety technology background, and actually saw some of that transformation myself within those two industries and verticals as well. Within public safety, for example, one of the biggest drivers of inefficiency within public safety was these data silos between, for example, the computer-aided 911 dispatch system, your records management system, which was the one that manages crime, and then your jail and booking and sort of your investigative tools, where there were all these different tools that were all sort of part of the thing. But in reality, the value of the tool was sort of just being subsumed by the energy it took to move the data around from each of these tools, and the tools themselves didn't have access to the appropriate data to make the appropriate decision, given all the context in the operational picture. And so you'd see a lot of the integrated systems in public safety. We were one of those at my company, building sort of an integrated platform across all the different functions and all the different things, where all the data kind of moves in between seamlessly, and people can use the sort of full data picture to make the best decisions. In healthcare, where I was working, I think we're seeing that transformation as well, where we've already seen it sort of on the system of record side. So in the US, Epic and Cerner are the two big companies that really drive pretty much most of the business for hospitals and sort of consolidation within the space. And they basically do everything across the common operational picture, from the device and the medical device management to your billing, your revenue cycle management, your point of care operations, your healthcare, et cetera. It's all within that system, and they've integrated it all into everything. And now the next question is sort of, how do I make better decisions? And that's really what the sort of integrated system allows health tech systems, is why those systems have subsumed the kind of point solutions across the different functions across those things. And I think we're really hitting the same thing in fuel distribution, right? We may have different systems across all these different departments and disciplines, and you can make sort of locally maximum decisions within those, but it's very hard to sort of make informed decision across all of those data points. And so there's really a ceiling to how much value you can get out of the siloed systems, because it requires a lot of manual operations. It requires kind of unrepeatable processes sometimes to coordinate between them, and that clear common operating picture across everything is what we kind of believe drives truly better decision making and outcomes.
I love that point you make, Steve, that there's learnings in other industries that we can apply to ours, and to keep our eyes open for those.
Yep. Awesome. I'll turn back over to you, Mike.
Yep. Thanks, Steve. If we drill into tank wagons just a little bit, and I want to correct something that some people, including ourselves, sometimes get wrong about tank wagons and bobtail delivery. It's easy to hear multi-stop delivery and think it's a routing problem. Just find the shortest path between the stops, but it's not. Before a truck ever leaves the yard, customer service decided whether or not this stop happens at all. Pricing has decided what price to apply to a customer because we've had a market movement. Supply has decided which terminal has product and which product's available. And only after all that does dispatch make its own calls. Which truck, which compartment that's a fit for my product, which driver, which route. And none of these decisions belong exclusively to dispatch. their pricing decisions, their supply decisions, their customer decisions. Dispatch just sits at the intersection of them and is expected to get every single one right all day with information that's often a phone call or spreadsheet away, instead of really already sitting in front of them. So that's the point that I think Steve's trying to make and we're trying to make, is we believe next evolution of productivity is really going to come from being able to have systems that can handle more of these functions natively and together. And if we just look at one simple example and to kind of explain why this work is hard, take a simple decision. Let's assume we're going to skip one stop. And maybe that's the right stop. Maybe the customer can wait. Maybe the stop's out of the way. Maybe the truck's running behind. In isolation, that may be the right choice, but the consequences don't stop with that one stop. Truck utilization changes because now the rest of the route looks different. Retains change because now we've got gallons we didn't drop. The terminal loading changes tomorrow because we've got volume on the truck and we can't load on top. Driver hours change because now the driver's finished earlier. Customer inventory changed because now you have a different run out risk. And eventually all this show up in margin. So one decision, 6 consequences. And the problem is not that operators don't understand these consequences, they do. The problem is that no one person can evaluate them perfectly all day in real time while the phone's ringing and the plan's changing. So this is again, another reason for why optimization is difficult. So this is kind of the human side of the problem. Dispatchers can make 100 interconnected decisions in a day. Which order should go first, which customers are at risk, which terminal is best, which drivers are available. But again, they can't make these decisions in this rapidly changing environment. So again, our view is the business has gotten more complex, the operating model is more complex, and we've got to provide technology that help these dispatchers make decisions so we can move away from heroics to kind of standard operating procedures. And with that, I will pass it back to Steve to share a little bit about how we can make some of those interconnected decisions.
Sure. I think if you think about connected decisions, I think the first iteration that we had in terms of systems was obviously all these systems are built to sort of gather information and then to present it to a set of users for those users to sort of make decisions using that, and then just kind of pass it on down the chain, then allowing logging and sort of making that decision after that. But now, so we have much more interconnected systems. So connected trucks, we have integrations with all sorts of hardware. We have real-time sort of information about location and where things are at and the level of the tank, et cetera. So we have much better operational awareness around everything. So the expectations now, I think we've kind of hit the local maximum. Hey, like these systems that did add a lot of value, but now we have more information, but there's almost too much information for any one person to keep it in their head, and not alone that make a quick decision based off of like the previous example that we talked about. So we have that operational awareness. We have connected trucks. These are sort of like the dependencies for this. But when you talk about like what's next, I think it really goes down to that next layer of decision support. When we sort of talk about AI in the space, and I think it's actually pretty prevalent in other industries too, you don't think about it quite like ChatGPT or Claude answering a question. You think of it as a decision support layer across all these different tools, across all these different systems that allows us to sort of data mine all that data in order for us to suggest or to provide a better set of information to make a better connected decision. And I think I saw that in my last job in health tech, where we were using the whole point of the company was to data mine the health record, and 97% of the data in the health record, because there's so much information coming from these automated systems, connected systems, is actually not seen and not even looked at by the doctors in order to make their health decisions. And so we have like whole companies, right? Like my last one, that we're trying to data mine that data, provide algorithms on top of it, to provide a suggested diagnosis. And you can see sort of the parallel into this industry as well, where you take all that data, and now if we get all that data into one place and we provide a sort of intelligence or a layer on top of that to provide you, hey, maybe in this situation, this is the most optimal decision. I know you don't have time to go look at every single data point in order to make that, but this could be a suggested way of going. That's really what we're, I think, seeing. It gives you a lot of value on top of these systems. If you want to go to the next slide.
Yep.
Yeah, that's kind of where we are today. I think, where does this go in the future, and sort of where are we going, where the puck is headed, rather than sort of where we're kind of all going today. We've got meter integrations, we've got the connected trucks, we've got real-time visibility. That's sort of like the table stakes, I think, for rollout and getting all these things out there. But when you think about it, it's like we think about forecasting as sort of, in the past, maybe it's something you did in a spreadsheet, something that you did in arrears after you've gotten all this data, something that you've seen like, okay, we did this big process, very manual. Obviously the first step of that is sort of, how do we automate that? How do we get that into a process that we can run all the time? And then if you take it a little bit further, well, that decision that Mike was talking about before, well, what if I make a change in real time to the actual operations of the system? How does that change our forecasting? How does it change like what we should do in our overall plan across everybody? Well, if we can run that forecasting as faster, right? If we can run it sort of on demand when things happen and when exceptions happen, essentially, then we can get into an even more optimized situation where really not leaving anything off the table there. And same thing, the sort of the day-to-day, the sort of the manual stuff that doesn't require a lot of thinking. I think especially with the LLMs and sort of where we're at now, you can find a lot of that sort of rote sort of planning. Can that go away? We can become more exception based in how we plan things, right? Like there's a rule here, but and for the most part, our intelligence sort of tells us that this is good, and maybe it even tells us in the future, hey, this wasn't so great. Can we sort of adopt and update the route? So that's kind of where we're thinking about it. Can we have multiple outcomes? Can we have sort of in real time planning those outcomes and planning that optimization? And then in the future, can we have sort of our systems tell us, hey, this, in the future, we should be making these changes so that we're getting the impact right now rather than, a month or a week later when we're doing our analysis. And I think just the last thing I think on top of that, everyone talks about AI, and everybody at this point knows like Claude and OpenAI and all the agents. We think about that as in terms of like an agentic layer. If there's a level of intelligence on top of your data, can that agent now look at that data and look at make some decisions and suggest that those decisions on top of you? So just helping our people that are operating in each of those functions, maybe taking the low level sort of easy work out of the play and letting you handle the exceptions.
Where do I get started? Thinking about this is where the industry may be going, may look a little bit different, but directionally, and where I'm at today. What steps do I take today to get me on that path?
Cool. I can add a point, and then I think Mike will probably be able to answer better. But I think when it comes down to it, it's understanding where your data is, being able to consolidate it into all the same places. Like if they're all data silos, it's just very hard to make connected decisions, right? It's just, from a just physics perspective, something doesn't have access to these things. And then think about, do we even have the dependencies in place in order to do this, right? So, there's sort of like that table stakes standard there. If we don't have enough of the real-time visibility, for example, then obviously we can't make real-time decisions, right? We have to make decisions in arrears. So that's where I would say is just like, look at your maturity right now. Do we need to take our maturity up here? And then we can start to think about adding on top of that. That's where we get to that intelligence layer. Yeah, I'll leave it to Mike too.
No, I think that was beautiful. I want to just to be aware of time. I'll just I'll close with that kind of our closing statement. Again, our perspective is, the companies, that will win over the next decade are just going to dispatch trucks more efficiently. They're going to make kind of better decisions across the network, across their business. And if I'll just say one thing about Gravitate, it's the only thing, we've spent the last decade building towards these connected decisions. And we believe the future is bright. The future is really bright for being able to make global optimal decisions. And we obviously thank you for spending time with us. And in the future, we'd love to hear what resonated, what you agree with, and what you disagree with. And yeah, thank you everyone for your time.
Makes sense. Thank you, Mike and Steve. And I like that point that you make about that interconnected decision across all these various spokes on your wheel here. It's not as simple. It seems simple on the surface what we're doing, and it's not that simple. And having that kind of data that can connect across all these things and help optimize that complete decision is what we need for sure. I'm going to change gears here. We're going to move over to Towne. Don, I'm going to make you the presenter. But Don is the vice president at Petro-Exchange, and we talked about like that interconnected decision. We think about inventory and the capital that is tied up in our businesses. We have very capital intensive businesses, and the better we can utilize that capital, the more money we have for buying trucks and other things that are out there. So really excited to have Don talk with us about strategic approaches, particularly around surplus inventory in our industry that we have. And Petro-Exchange, just to give you a high level of them, they support downstream petroleum companies, us, in solving challenges related to surplus, slow-moving, and underutilized inventory. They do this through a structured and secure platform that they've built, and ultimately allows businesses to efficiently move excess products and equipment to others. And that way, new people can have the right inventory and you can have the right inventory. Don, you are specialized in online marketplaces and particularly serving our industry. I know that your background is in marketing, digital strategy, and platform development. So we're really excited to hear you share a little bit more about unlocking capital. So I'll turn the floor over to you.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me today. And so I want to talk about something that sits in plain sight in almost every petroleum marketing and convenience retail operation, and even in the delivery fleet trucks that many of you manage yourselves in. That's surplus inventory. So tanks, equipment, parts, vehicles, product inventory that's just no longer actively working for you. So my goal today isn't just to point out that it's a problem, but to walk you through a practical way to think about it. So what it's actually costing you, what's changing and how companies are handling it, and then how do you manage the risk when you do sell it, and a simple framework that you can bring back to your team. So here's where we're headed. I'm going to start with financial impact of idle inventory. So what it's really costing you for those assets to sit. And then we'll look at a few industry trends that are reshaping how companies are thinking about asset management. Then from there, we'll talk about reducing risk in secondary asset transactions, specifically how the channel that you choose can either protect or expose your brand. And then we'll close with a strategic framework for asset evaluation and reallocation that you can put to work right away. So I want to start with thinking about a mindset shift, because it's easy to think about surplus inventory that's just sitting in a yard as something that's neutral. It's not a big deal. It's not actively hurting anything. But the truth is that's not really the full picture. So across petroleum marketing and convenience operators, it's common to see anywhere from 50 to 25% in asset value tied up in, and that is idle at any given time. And really, that's even a conservative number, because Industry Distribution Magazine did an industrial analysis and found that upwards of 30% of companies have dead or obsolete inventory, even in well-run companies. So that's also not just something I've read. I've heard it firsthand in talking with distributors across the US for months now as we've been introducing Petro-Exchange to the market. And in the companies that I've talked to, they've ranged from 5 figures in excess inventory, idle inventory, upwards to over $1 million that are sitting on the books. So quite the range, but it is a real problem that companies are dealing with. And so in a lot of these organizations, equipment can sit for even up to 3 to 5 years before anybody makes a formal decision about what to do about it. So that's not just a rounding number, it's real recoverable capital that's just sitting there. So the cost of an idle asset isn't just what you pay for, it's what it prevents that capital from doing next. So where does this actually show up? I would put this into 4 categories, 4 buckets. The first is in idle equipment and rolling stock. So that's tanks, pumps, dispensers, trucks, and trailers that have been pulled out of active rotation but haven't been formally retired. And then the next category is excess markets and MRO inventory. So that's maintenance, repair, and operating stock that got bought for redundancy and then just ended up staying. It's easy to overbuy just in case, but much harder to go back and right size it later. And then the third bucket here is excess and aging product inventory. So that's overstocked lubricants or products that are just nearing shelf life that's quietly tying up capital. And then the fourth is legacy and decommissioned assets. So systems that have been retired, but where the disposition decision just keeps getting put off to the next quarter. So I would encourage you to kind of mentally check off where your inventory and assets might be sitting in any of these buckets. And in a lot of the companies that I've been speaking with, like I said, across the US for the last several months, the bucket that keeps coming up in these conversations is aging and surplus product that comes up for these distributors. And that makes sense because these products are more closely tied to your brand than just a fleet or equipment problem. So for a long time, the default approach to excess inventory, surplus inventory was reactive. You would purchase it, park it, forget about it. And then maybe if it sat for too long, you would offer it at a discount once you realized you were running out of yard space or warehouse space, or until somebody asked the question about what are we going to do with what's sitting here. But that approach I'm finding is becoming harder and harder to justify. And there's 3 main forces behind that. The first is the rise in digitized asset marketplaces, and that's because buyers and sellers of industrial surplus can just find each other that much more directly on platforms that are built for this type of equipment, instead of relying on word of mouth or informal lists that are passed back and forth between distributors or regional auctions or a broker who just might know somebody. The second is tightening regulatory and environmental expectations, so that's UST compliance requirements, lender and insurance underwriting standards, and supply agreement obligations from branded fuel distributors who are all pushing operators to run at just a more structured, well-documented asset disposition. And then the third is in market volatility. So that swings in the marketplace and fuel prices, in commodity costs and fleet demand that is pushing operators just to run leaner. So this means that the old model of holding excess inventory just in case for years is just giving way to the need to convert idle capital into cash just faster. So if you put these 3 things together, the direction is clear. Companies are moving from this just being an occasional cleanup that they do to continuous proactive asset management.
And it feels so true. I remember a study group member telling me a story that his father was in the business, son was getting involved. He was about 20 years old, walks in and looks in the warehouse and got all these products up there. And dad says, son, you know what all this is? It's cash. And it kind of really made him resonate that, yeah, all this product in here is money that can be used for other things, just like what you're talking about. And our approach, it really feels, has been inactive, reactive over time, just as you described, without good solutions for how we move it. It kind of gets pushed in the back of the warehouse or out in the field, and we forget about it till something comes along to cause this. So look forward to hearing you tell us about some solutions to this.
Yeah, absolutely. So here's the part that's easy to underestimate, and that is how you sell your surplus assets matters just as much as whether or not you sell them, because done carelessly, this disposition can create brand new liabilities rather than close them out. So I would put this into 4 risk categories. And the first is a valuation risk. So you either undersell the asset or you trust an appraisal that doesn't have real market comparables behind it. And so it ends up just being a number. The second is in counterparty risk. And that is when you end up with an unvetted buyer who defaults after taking possession of the product, or who misrepresents themselves for a deal that you wouldn't have otherwise made. And this one matters more than people think, because if you have your own supply agreement that you are restricted on who you sell to, then if somebody's misrepresented themselves, then you, through no fault of your own, have become in breach of your own contract. And then the third risk here is compliance and safety risk. So that's an incomplete title or chain of custody records that, environmental safety or regulatory exposure that doesn't actually end just because the sale is closed. And then the fourth is documentation risk. So that's incomplete title or chain of custody records that don't cause a problem today, but could surface months or years later. So I want to talk about this counterparty risk here for a second, because when I was talking with distributors across the US, one conversation that kept coming up was that they would run into trying to take this surplus inventory that they have, sell it on a secondary channel. A buyer would come in, make the purchase, take the product off the site, and then the credit card would come back declined. And so then they were left with the product that was gone, but the money's not there. And then they didn't really have a lot of recourse to know what to do next. And that was just a common risk that I kept hearing about over and over again in speaking with distributors. And so the thing to think about with all of these risks is that none of them show up during the transaction most of the time, or in these cases, they show up after the transaction has happened. So that's why it makes them a little bit harder to estimate or see coming. But the good news is that there's a fairly direct countermeasure to each one of them. So for valuation risk, it's making sure that your pricing is fixed in grounded, real comparable secondary transactions, and that it's not just a static book value or one appraiser's opinion. And then for the counterparty risk, it's working through a channel where transactions are run through an independent third-party management rather than just a fully anonymous listing, because you can't always control who's on the other side of the transaction, but you can and do your best to make sure that the transaction is mediated. It doesn't have to go unmediated. And then so for the compliance and safety risk, it's making sure that you have a complete documentation. So title, condition, regulatory records, you ensure that those items travel with your product, so that way the liability doesn't then travel back to you. And then for documentation risk, it's just insisting on a secure, auditable transaction trail so that you could produce it if a question ever comes up down the road. And so none of this is a one-time checklist, and the organizations that do this the best make it a repeatable process that's just built into their operation rather than just a one-year project that they run once a year. And so here's something that's easy to overlook, and that's decommissioned equipment, retired signage, or closed sites that don't stop being associated with you just because the sale has happened. Because where these items end up and how they're represented after the sale can reflect back on your company. And so there's a few specific ways that this shows up. It's equipment that's resold into markets that conflict with your brand standards, or branded assets that turn up in gray markets or unauthorized channels that you never intended. And then also in environmental or safety incidents that are associated with your product that you sold, your equipment that you sold, that can get traced back to you if the name is still recognizable. And so for a lot of operators, this isn't just hypothetical, because many distributors carry agreements that restrict who they can sell to. And so often it's only to other distributors who carry the same brand. So in this case, the channel that you choose to sell through isn't just a preference, it really is a contractual reality. And so it's not just a financial decision, it's a brand decision as well. And so what does this look like when it's handled well? The first is it's a controlled marketplace. Sorry, I think I'm off of my slides here. Let me go back. You restrict where an item can be resold, so it doesn't end up in a competing market or a territory that you never intended for it to be in, or in a use case that reflects poorly on your brand. And the second is in debranding and decommissioning protocols, developing those so that before anything changes hand, you've ensured that your signage, your library, anything that identifies your company with it is removed or neutralized. And then in chain of custody tracking. It's keeping a documented trail of where an asset actually goes so that if questions ever come up later, you have an answer and you can produce details on that answer. And fourth is by making sure that every sale is backed by manageable and accountable transactions. So you make sure that it's run through an independent transaction management, not just a listing and a handshake. And so when all these four things are in place, disposition stops being a brand risk and starts being another well-managed part of how you do your business. So how do you operationalize everything that I'm covering? It is through a strategic framework that you bring in. And so the goal is to take this from just a surplus review that you do occasionally into an ongoing discipline, and one that tells you what is actually idle in your inventory, how much it costs, and where it should go next. And so I'm going to walk us through these 4 steps on how to do that. And number 1, you're going to inventory what's idle and underutilized across your organization, and you'll categorize it by type, condition, and age, because you can't manage what you haven't counted. And the question isn't what is this asset worth? It's what else could this capital be doing? So in doing this, in the assess and classify phase, you're going to establish a market-based value for every asset, and you're going to use comparable secondary transactions, not just a book value that may or may not have meant anything for years now. So in practice, this looks like looking at true comparables, the same make and model, similar age and condition, and not just the broad category, using real recent transaction data, what things have actually sold for versus what somebody hopes to list it for. And then you adjust for condition, location, and compliance factors that may impact the price. And you use more than one comparable when you can so that you have a defensible range, not just a single antidote, and you document your methodology, not just the number. So it can hold up later if questions come up, and then you revisit that periodically because values decay just like assets do. So an asset can lose value to one organization without losing value altogether. That's an important piece of this to remember as you're thinking about your surplus and how you're doing this. What you want to do with value and benchmark is route each asset to the path that matches its risk and brand profile. So some things may go through that controlled marketplace, and it looks like a used tank on a platform built for the industry, visible to a broader pool of buyers. It has a documented process and a secured checkout. Then there's direct resale, like reselling to a jobber that you've known for years, and that would be, one-on-one negotiations, and no listing that's necessarily needed. And this makes more sense if you've known the buyer for years and the brand risk is low. But if you have known, if the buyer is unknown and the brand has a higher regulation or exposure, then you'll want to put it into that marketplace factor. And then for any item that just doesn't have any resale demand or value left, that could go to scrap or recycling. And then the fourth is reallocate and reinvest. So that's converting your proceeds into working capital and reinvesting directly into your operations. And then the cycle just repeats. So the organizations that do this the most, that get the most value out of this, they treat it as a standing quarterly process, not a one-time project that you run once the warehouse or the yard space is getting full. And so just some of the key takeaways here are breaking this down just into 5. It's that idle inventory is a live financial drag, not a dormant line item. And that industry momentum, so the rise in digital marketplaces, the tightening of regulatory expectations and volatility, this favors continuous proactive asset strategy over reactive cleanup. And then the third is a disclosed, documented process that de-risks every secondary transaction. And then fourth, the channel that you choose can either protect or expose your brand, and as well as your balance sheet. And then 5, a repeatable framework that turns surplus review into an actual source of capital, not just an occasional cleanup. So sometimes unlocking capital isn't just about buying something new, it's about looking differently at what you already own. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about where Petro-Exchange comes into this picture. It is a B2B marketplace for US-based, for the downstream petroleum industry, and we have 4 main categories: lubricants, delivery and transportation, retail, convenience store, and truck stops, and then storage tanks and tank farms. So our channel takes all these things into place for the downstream petroleum sector. We have those safeguards in place for buyers and sellers. When I was mentioning how important it was to have a managed transaction, and so those safeguards. So we offer this platform for downstream petroleum markets to be able to list on the platform, and for buyers to find specific niche products that are relevant to the downstream petroleum industry. And so in offering that, and Jed was mentioning this earlier, my background is in marketing. It's better to have a phrase that we have in marketing is that it's better to have 1,000 engaged followers than 1 million unengaged followers. So that's where Petro-Exchange really separates itself, because you could have your products on a site that has multiple different types of audiences that cater to that specific platform, but your specific niche product may not be in front of the right audience. So with Petro-Exchange, it is being able to list your specific product and making sure that you're getting in front of buyers, the right audience. And so if somebody would want to learn more about Petro-Exchange, I have a QR code on the screen. You could go to the site. We have been speaking with a lot of lubricants distributors across the U.S., but we are really actively looking for convenience store, retail, and truck stop outlet sellers that could list tank wagons, trailers, storage tanks. And so that is, in a nutshell, Petro-Exchange, and a way that you can turn idle capital into cash.
I really like this, Dawn. I mean, in a lot of ways, it feels like eBay, but specific for our industry, because I feel like there's, people may realize they got older, slow moving inventory, but they really lack that connection of who's going to buy it. Maybe, and people call me sometimes, oh, I converted from this lubricant brand to this lubricant brand. I got this old inventory, or I lost a key customer. Hey, Jed, you know anybody who, may want it? And I don't really keep lists on all that kind of thing. But, this is a very a boutique platform to where you can match those strategic distributors with each other.
Yes, and actually it's interesting because even the idea for Petro-Exchange was born out of conversations with an industry leader who was talking with other distributors, and they were sharing how there was no easy way to, or a streamlined way to sell their assets and their old equipment in a way that protected both buyers and sellers and had those checks and balances in place. And so those conversations happened in study groups. And so a lot of great ideas can be born out of study groups and those conversations that are happening among distributors.
100% appreciate that testimonial there. And what I like too, it's not just product, but also equipment that can be moved through this exchange as well. And you gave some really great points about, when you go out on your own, these are some risks that you just need to be careful of, which many of us don't often think about when we're moving our products out to random third parties that we're selling it to. So appreciate those tips and tricks that you provided, Dawn. And of course, if anybody wants to learn more about Petro-Exchange, you've given your contact information where they can do that here as well. So good stuff. Well, I want to thank you, Dawn. Thank Mike and Steve, who are on with us on the front end, and our audience as well. Before the audience goes, I just want to remind you to check out our SG Voices website. There you can find more valuable content, including past webinar recordings, educational articles that people have. And really our goal is to help provide you those kind of go-to industry ideas that's going to help you improve your businesses over time and really help them thrive. Also, you can stay updated on our upcoming events by signing up for our next webinar. It's going to be Thursday, August 13th. We're going to have PBS Solutions and PIX Payments, talking about how we can give commercial and wholesale customers instant access to invoices, balances, and payment options, and also help free up our AR team from constant phone calls. So I'd love to see you there. And lastly, just want to say, take a moment. There'll be, when you sign off, a very short survey, take you like 10 seconds to complete, but we just want to get your feedback on how this resonated with you. Again, our goal is to provide great educational content to you, so always appreciate your feedback to help us do it. Hope you enjoy this summer, the great weather and warm weather that we're having out there, and look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.